Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the course. But in a sense, it's a little bit more than that. We're actually in our second week today. We're on days 7, 8, and 9, which is pretty crazy. When you start thinking that one day is actually 3 days of normal time, things are going pretty fast and pretty furious too. For the last 2 days, I've been piling on the work, and I'm afraid that today is not going to be an exception. The pile of work I have for you today reaches all the way to the heights of Mount Olympus. Hyperbole. If I wanted to compare the amount of work I have for you with Mount Olympus would pale in comparison and seem to be just a tiny little mound compared to the pile of work that lies before you. Juxtaposition, another one of our terms. Actually, today is going to be a bit of a low-key day. It's not going to be a day off, but the amount of work that I'm going to be asking from you is less because we're going to start reading Heart of Darkness today. I want to set some time aside from that and give people a chance to catch up a little bit if you've fallen behind in the first couple of days. So I've got a 3-part lesson for you today, like I always do. The first part relates to poetry, and I felt that it would have been a real shame if I didn't get a chance to put some Canadian poets onto the course. Things are moving pretty fast and there's not a lot of room for all the poets that I would like to put on. Like I would love to get Margaret Atwood in there and Michael Ondaatje. I'd like to get B.P. Nichol in there. I'd like to get a lot of people in there, but I can't just because of time. So I've chosen a couple of Aboriginal writers and I've put them on there. And pretty simple. What you want to do is review some literary terms, hence my introduction to this video. I've got a list of, I think, 12 that I sort of saw with the submissions that came in. They were 12 that people had a little bit of trouble with, so I've got them on a list, and I'm going to get you to choose a couple of them to use in a response to one of 2 poems. You're going to be looking at one that's a lyrical poem and one that is not, and you're going to decide which one is the better poem. For some of you, it's going to be an easy choice. You're just naturally one of those 2 styles of poetry is going to appeal to you. For anybody who you feel torn, honestly, just choose one and roll with it. Really what I want you to get with this first part is just a little bit of a review, having another look at some poetry, some Canadian poetry this time, and being able to apply some of our vocabulary from that first assignment. That was a massive assignment, it really was, but it's an important one too. I think that it's really important for you to start off with a clear sense of the vocabulary that you're going to be using throughout the course. We're going to have a unit on rhetoric, hence the rhetorical devices. We're going to be studying several novellas, hence the narrative devices, and every piece of literature has got structure and style. So those devices, you're going to be using those in order to frame your response for the first part. Then we're going to move away from poetry and we're going to start looking at Heart of Darkness. So the third part of today's lesson is just some work time. I've decided that you should have at least one class period worth of time to just do some reading. For those of you who've already started reading Heart of Darkness, that's awesome. Keep going. Try to get the entire work read before we get to next week, because if you read it through once, you'll find next week is going to be much easier than if you're seeing Heart of Darkness for the first time. So let me get to lesson 2B now. Some of you are going to find lesson 2B to be pretty bizarre. How many teachers have you had who have encouraged you to use the Sparks Notes for a piece of literature? I'm going to assume not many, but I do. So here's the thing. If you're reading a piece of literature for pure enjoyment, you probably don't want the ending spoiled. You probably want to read all the way through the rising action, get to the climax, be surprised if it's like an action style of climax, to experience that action that happens. If it's a revelation style climax, to have your mind blown by whatever the revelation is of the story. You want that experience, but let's be realistic. You're probably not here because of your love of reading. You're probably here because you want to get a rockin' mark in this 4U English course. So your purpose for reading is different, and your approach should suit your purpose. So what is the best way to get lost in a piece of literature, to just jump into it. Perfect way to get lost. And think about it. How many times have you had, maybe even so far in this course, how many times have you been presented with a piece of literature and you start to read it and you just can't really keep track of everything and you get confused, and when you get confused you get frustrated, when you get frustrated just everything works against you in your understanding. So the method that I want to introduce to you is what I call the roadmap method of pre-reading. So imagine that a story is like a forest. All right, we're going to use an analogy, one of our rhetorical devices. Story is like a forest, right? And the plot is a path through that forest. Well, if you had a map of the forest, you'd be able to find your way through it pretty easy. Much easier than if you just kind of wandered into it. And for those of you who have seen the Blair Witch Project, that can be a really bad scene. So in order to develop a roadmap, I suggest going to Video Sparks Notes. And I've actually put them on to the today's lesson. It's there along with Thug Notes, which I alluded to before, and also Shmoop. These are not substitutes for reading, but they are definitely resources that are valuable to give you that roadmap that you're going to need. So here's the idea. If you are approaching a work of literature with a good understanding of what's going to happen, you're not going to get lost. If you know who the characters are before you approach it, even if you have a vague sense of who you're going to meet, you're going to be able to follow your way through the story. If you know what the setting is and you know that the setting is going to change, if nothing surprises you as you read, you're going to be able to go through the story fairly easily, I would say, in comparison to wandering through it. And that is going to help you to walk away with your literal understanding of the work. Just like I said for yesterday's lesson, when I approach a new poem, the first thing I want is a literal surface understanding of what's going on. Absolutely same thing is true for a novel, even more so because it's so much easier to get lost in a novel or a novella because it's a longer work. So use the roadmap method, watch the Sparks Notes, watch Thug Notes, watch whatever you need to watch. Get a basic understanding of three things: plot, character, and setting. Those three structural elements are the keys to understanding any story. Once you have a literal understanding of Heart of Darkness, you'll be able to follow it through a second time for a second reading and to get a sense of the figurative or underlying meaning of the story much more easily than if you're lost. Think about it. If in that forest somewhere there is treasure, and somebody tells you that you just have to find your way to it, but if you get lost, 20 feet into that forest, there's no way you're going to find that treasure. In the same way, if there is like an intellectual treasure in Heart of Darkness, some amazing underlying truth that Conrad is going to share with us, you're never going to find it if you can't even figure out the plot, characters, and setting. So that's what today's lesson is going to be about. A little bit of poetry, and then pre-reading and time to read and get caught up. As always, please get in touch with me with any questions or concerns you have. My office hours are 9 to 12, but I also check my email all day. Please get in touch with me if you need to. Good luck.